There are two dates on the calendar which literally define your gardening season and have a huge impact on the success of your gardening year. Join me today as I discuss the two most important gardening dates. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and of course I'm talking about the first frost date in fall and the last frost date in spring. But these simple dates are too often misunderstood or not correctly applied by most gardeners. If you wait until those frost dates to take any action in your garden, you've waited too long. And that's the biggest concern when it comes to how you use these dates. My first frost date is fast approaching. It's about 6 weeks away, which means I need to anticipate and start taking action within my garden. The kind of actions that are going to take 2, 4, 6 weeks before I see the results of those actions, so that I can get all of this done before my first frost date approaches. Most gardeners are well aware of their last frost date in spring because that date defines when we start our seeds and we can actually get outside and start putting plants out in our garden. But it's more than just looking at those dates and deciding whether we have action to take or seeds to start. The main issue is that even though we discuss two specific important dates, it's really not that simple. I can tell you that my last frost date in spring is May 18th. But I've been gardening here in Colorado for more than 2 decades, and I've never had my last frost actually occur on May 18th. Sometimes it's been a week before that. It's even been as much as 2 weeks after that. And that's what leads to a lot of the misunderstanding when it comes to these particular dates. Now, you should know what yours are, and I'll put links in the description below to help you find your frost dates if you don't know them. Knowing them is just the beginning. Knowing how they work is really how you determine the influence of these important dates in your own garden. The frost dates are average dates that have been determined after reviewing climatological data over many decades. So even though May 18th might be my specific frost date, it's an average. And as I've seen, sometimes the frost comes before, sometimes the frost comes after. Now, it's important to note that frost dates have nothing to do with your hardiness zone. I'm in zone 5B here in Colorado, and my first frost date in the autumn is September 29th. But you may be in a zone 5B, and your first frost date might not come until October or November, or maybe even December. So recognize that these are two different things. Hardiness zones are based on an average as well, but it's the average coldest temperature in winter. For the first and last frost dates, we're purely looking at the time of year that we get the frost that's going to impact our garden and plants like these tomatoes. And this is how we can use the awareness of the frost dates in our garden to our advantage, with the understanding that they're guidelines. Even though we have a specific date, it really isn't a specific date. It's a general time of year that can be narrowed down to a week and a month, and our gardening activities need to operate within that growing season window from the last frost date to the first frost date. Because what plants are we typically growing in summer? Well, it's the tomatoes and the peppers and the squashes and the melons and all of those other plants that can't handle any cold temperatures. When these plants are exposed to freezing, they die. So as a guideline, we have to understand these frost dates so that we can start our plants, grow our plants, and harvest our plants within that particular growing season. Now, of course, there are many plants that will grow outside that window. Because tomatoes are among the most favorite crops of gardeners around the world, that's why we're looking at a plant like this during the summer and concerned about when the cold weather approaches. If we could define our growing season with just these two dates as a general guideline, gardening would be relatively easy because we know when our season begins, when our season ends, and the activities that need to fit within that window. But of course, we need to throw a wrench in the machinery. When you look at some of these links below and you go to those sites, you might see a 10% frost date or a 90% frost date. So now, instead of just 2 dates, we really should be aware of maybe 6 dates, especially in a region like mine where I have very harsh weather with rapidly changing conditions. So as I look to the first frost date that's coming, I'm talking about a 50% frost date, where half the time the frost has occurred before that date and half the time the frost has occurred after that date. But I also have to be aware of the 10% frost date, because 10% of the time a frost has occurred by that date. And that's why I say I have to be aware and start taking action 2, 4, 6 weeks before, because it's possible I'll get a frost a couple weeks before my average frost date of September 29th. And that's what happened in my garden last year. I had a freeze on September 15th that killed most of my summer crops, and I wasn't ready for it. This is still a new garden. I'm still developing the methods that I'm using with hoops and covers. And that's one of the easiest ways to protect your plants when the cold weather comes. It's just with hoops covered by plastic. But I wasn't ready for that, and I lost a lot of my plants. I do know that here in Colorado, if I can get past that first frost or freeze, it might be 3 or 4 weeks before I get another one. So I just have to protect the plants for that one night, maybe 2 nights, and then it's clear sailing for weeks to come. That's how you should approach these frost dates, is understanding the weather patterns and your own climate so that you can protect your plants when they need protection. And they'll need that protection when you have an understanding of the potential of the frost that's coming. And it's similar in spring. In the spring, I use the 90% last frost date. That means that 90% of the time, there won't be another frost past that date. But, kind of like I just described in the fall, there is a 10% chance that I will get frost after that date. And I've experienced that. So I and most of the gardeners in my area give our last frost date a 2-week buffer before we put our tomatoes and peppers in the ground. And so while my last frost date average, the 50% date, might be May 18th, I'm not planting my garden out with these kind of plants until the beginning of June. And this is where a lot of confusion arises, particularly for new gardeners. Because you'll read a seed packet and it will say to start the seeds 6 weeks before your last frost date, and then it will tell you to put the plants out on the first frost date. And I'm telling you, I wait 2 weeks after the frost date to put the plants in the garden. The key point to take away is that it's your garden. You decide when the plants go in the ground. These frost dates are just guidelines. And in many areas, they don't get those late freezes in spring or early freezes in autumn like I do. They have a more average growing season. And that's what a lot of these seed companies are putting on their packages. So as you grow in your garden and as you talk with more gardeners in your area, you have to soak in the information that the others have gained over the years. When I first started gardening here, I heard right off the bat that you don't start tomatoes on the last frost date. You wait until Memorial Day weekend, which is always at the end of May. I've learned since then that sometimes that's too early. That's why I wait until the beginning of June. Experience drives a lot of what we do in the garden. And a lot of that experience is driven by understanding how the frost dates affect us as the guidelines that we use for our activities. Now that we're going into the autumn, I'm looking at my first frost date. As I choose when to put new seeds in the ground for my fall crops, when I prune some of my plants at the end of season like these tomatoes, and when I pull out plants and just call it an end to the season and start preparing the soil for next spring. It's a guideline, often based on experience, but the more you understand about these frost dates, the better you'll do in your garden. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.